Hello and welcome to this review of the Xiaomi Redmi 1S. Now the Xiaomi Redmi 1S is of course a budget phone by Xiaomi launched in India recently for Rs 6000. After making headlines with the Mi 3, this Chinese smartphone manufacturer has again managed to pack in impressive specs at a budget price. So let's just get the tech specs out of the way first. So it's got a quad-core 1.6 GHz Qualcomm Snapdragon 400 MSM 8228 CPU with an Adreno 305 GPU, a gig of RAM, a 4.7-inch IPS display panel with a resolution of 1280 by 720, with Asahi's Dragon Trail scratch-resistant glass, an 8-megapixel rear camera with BSI sensor at f2.2 aperture, and on the front a 1.6-megapixel camera. The internal storage is 8 GB, expandable to 64 GB, and the battery is a 2050 mAh battery. The Redmi 1S looks quite nice. While it may not be the sexiest looking phone, it isn't too shabby either. The fit and finish of the device is very nice and it feels good to hold. The build quality is fine and overall the device feels robust. However, I will qualify that by saying that when pressed hard, you do hear some creaking somewhere towards the bottom. I don't necessarily feel that that's a negative because the device isn't meant to be used in that fashion. But there are others who might disagree. On the top, you have the 3.5mm audio jack, a bit off-center. On one side you have the volume rockers and the power button. These feel good and provide a good tactile feedback. The bottom houses the micro USB port and the adjacent side is plain. Overall, the size of the phone is big for a 4.7-incher by today's standards. I compared the dimensions of the Redmi with those of the other 5 inches such as the Asus Zenfone 5 and the Moto G and found them to be similar, at least on paper, judging by the manufacturer's specifications. The phone is larger mainly due to the thick bezels on either side as well as the parts which house the front camera and the capacitive buttons. Also, the phone isn't quite lightweight, but I wouldn't call it heavy either. This doesn't mean though that the phone is not good to hold in one hand. With the screen off, I could wrap my hands around the device quite comfortably. It's just that one-handed operation can at times be a bit tricky. So I can swipe comfortably across the width of the screen. However, pulling down the notification shade from the same position isn't possible and requires adjustments. I also at times find sliding across to receive calls a bit difficult. I do find the power button location to be excellent though and very accessible. The 4.7-inch screen itself is quite good. The 720p HD resolution gives it a PPI of 312. The text rendered is nice and sharp and the colors seem fairly accurate, though they seem to slightly err on the cooler side. You do have the ability of changing the color temperature and saturation in the settings though. The viewing angles are decent as well, though not the best. The screen is however quite reflective. I was concerned about this mainly because I thought it would be in poor visibility in direct sunlight. However, I found that that wasn't the case. The screen is still legible in direct sunlight. Having said that, the reflectivity can be a problem when playing games with tilt controls. At certain angles, you will definitely lose sight of parts of the on-screen elements. I assume though that a matte screen guard instead of the clear one will improve matters. I'm also relatively happy with the auto brightness sensor. The device adjusts quite well while moving from dark to daylight. This is what actually helps improve the readability of the screen outdoors despite the high reflectivity. However, the default brightness is still kept a bit low indoors, and on a few occasions I felt that the reduction in brightness was too extreme and sudden. The capacitive buttons on the Redmi are not backlit. That's a bit of a disappointment for me, not from the perspective of functionality, but rather looks. The red buttons look dull indoors, but under direct light they turn bright red, almost as if backlit, something I do like. There's also an LED for notifications. It blinks red when the phone needs charging, turns to white while charging, and green when the battery is more than 90% charged. It blinks blue when you do get a notification. But I feel that the intensity is a bit weak. In certain conditions, the blue light is barely noticeable. Luckily, there is an option to change the color of the notification LED to something different if you so wish, and that is nice. Coming to the back, the choice of the dark bluish grey is very elegant. The back itself looks textured and one would imagine that it would be rough to the touch. However, it is not. In fact, it is very smooth. The finish is matte as opposed to glossy, and while it is by no means a fingerprint magnet, I should mention that smudges will at times be visible. Nothing ugly though. So overall, a very good job on the back cover. The rear camera is a bit raised from the rest of the back. It seems to protrude out, something that may be of concern. And I'm not yet sure, even after close examination, whether the chrome-looking lip is raised enough to protect the glass. Now coming to one of the USPs of the device, MiUI. The first thing you'll probably notice is that the UI doesn't have an app drawer. So you only have the ability to scroll between home pages. You can of course add pages and use folders to organize apps, add widgets and change page transitions. But no app drawer. Not that it's a major deal, but you could always install a third-party launcher to get around this. The overall look of MiUI is quite nice. The design elements are elegant. There are neat little touches scattered throughout, which I found quite attractive. So there's the multicolored trails when you swipe the keyboard, the graphics in the SIM usage within security, or those used in the music player, or those against the contacts, the category view of the file explorer, or the very cool retro voice recorder. I also like how the calendar and weather app folder icons act as widgets and reflect changes in the date and weather. So while the default graphical elements are pretty good, you also have the added ability of being able to apply themes to further change the look of the UI. All you have to do is create a MiUI account and download themes. The themes give you the ability to change the fonts, the icons, the lock screen and the like. The changes can be subtle or dramatic, depending on which theme you choose. You also have the ability to only download an individual component of the UI, such as individual fonts, dial pads, boot animations, lock screens and so on. Coming to the lock screen, one nice touch is the ability to turn on the Torch app by holding down the home button. Double-clicking the power button can then be used to kill the torch. Also, a double tap while on the lock screen invokes the music player. Of the tools bundled with the phone, those clubbed under security are worth a mention. You have a cleaner for the file cache and other residual temporary files, such as ads for instance. There is also a data usage monitor which can also be used to restrict data usage per app. The stats can be useful in determining how much of the mobile and Wi-Fi networks are being used. There is also a blacklist app where rules can be set for which calls and messages are to be blocked. The power app, in addition to the power usage stats, can be used to select the battery profiles to be applied. Besides the default profile, you have the options of marathon and sleep. And further, you can set how and when the profiles are automatically switched. You also have the ability to set a schedule for the same. There is also a built-in virus scanner and a permission manager. The phone also has an inbuilt RAM manager invoked by long pressing the menu key. So you can see all the recent apps and choose to clear them from memory. You also have the option of selectively killing the apps from memory. So you basically pull down particular apps to prevent them from getting killed. Pulling on them a second time unlocks them and they can then be cleared. Other honorable mentions when speaking of apps include two that are exclusive to Xiaomi, the Mi Talk Messenger and access to the Mi Cloud. Among settings, there is the Do Not Disturb setting which will automatically silence any calls or notifications received when the phone is locked. Again, a schedule or an exception can be set up for the same. There is also a Mi Sound Enhancer, aka DRAC, which supposedly optimizes sound quality as per the earphones you choose, and a graphic equalizer for the music player. Also worth mentioning is the notification shade, which can house about 9 toggles at a given time. And you also have the ability to decide which ones show up. Lastly, one special feature of the One S is the light mode, or as I like to call it, the senior citizen mode. It is meant to ease the user experience for the first time Android user. So essentially, you have Windows-ish tiles, large fonts, no notification shade, no toggles, no long press actions, the ability to limit which apps are accessible on the home screen, and even a feature where the phone will call out the numbers pressed on the dial pad. Overall, MiUI is impressive. It is feature-rich, attractive, and quite customizable. And mostly, it is a smooth experience. Why mostly? I'll just come to that later. Coming to the settings on the camera front, you can set the flash to auto, always fire or not at all. You also have the panorama mode, HDR and a handheld twilight mode. I'm curious about what that actually does, because twilight of course implies a slower shutter speed, but handheld implies that some compensation is being made for the resultant camera shake. You can of course choose to change the focus mode from auto to macro and choose ISO settings from 100 to 1600. The exposure value can be changed, as can the white balance. Plus, there are various filters as well as scene modes such as sports, night, fireworks, sunset, snow, and the like. I did all my testing in the auto mode, and the camera performs admirably in auto mode for the price point and punches well above its weight. While well-lit scenes come out great, it even does a good job in difficult lighting conditions. The colors are pretty accurate both in terms of the hue and saturation as well as the white balance. However, on the 1S screen, they look a tad desaturated and cool to me. The default settings can however be tweaked to correct this. Evening shots and those in low light come out not only well exposed, but the noise is handled very well as well. Textures come out nice and sharp, and if they aren't tack sharp, I would put them down to camera shake rather than any inherent incapability. I say this because when I took multiple shots of the same scene or used the flash, at least one image would always come out tack sharp. Depth of field is shallow enough and spot metering works as expected. Here I was able to successfully expose for the bulb and avoid blown highlights. The HDR mode does a good job of lightening the shadows and the image is kept realistic, though slightly oversaturated at times. This is not a true HDR mode, however, as the camera is not bracketing exposures. Rather, the image seems to be processed in a manner similar to the shadow highlight adjustment in Photoshop. Performance-wise, the camera is quick to focus and fire, albeit with a slight delay when using the flash. For comparison, I used images from my old Panasonic Lumix LZ8 point and shoot. The Redmi 1S is at par with it in well-lit conditions and surpasses it in low-light conditions. The only major negative is the weak throw of the flash, but that is to be expected from a cell phone. On the video camera front, you can again have the flash on or off. You have the option of recording in 1080, 720 and 480p and adjusting the white balance as well. Plus, you can choose between tap focus and continuous autofocus. There is also a gimmicky mode called fast motion, which basically records it such that the playback looks like a Charlie Chaplin movie. Again, the video recording manages things well. The camera tries to adjust exposure with the change in lighting, and while that may not necessarily be always desirable, it can be controlled somewhat by using the tap focus function. The tap focus and continuous autofocus both work well, but change in the focus results in a jitter, which can be disconcerting. Now, of course, I don't have much experience with cell phone cameras and especially video recording, but I would not be wrong if I say that the rear camera performs much better than the price tag would suggest. To test gaming performance, I installed Real Racing 3. The game performs very smoothly and there is no lag and no frame skipping. However, the highest graphics settings are not selected. It's apparent from the fact that there is no reflectivity in the rear view mirrors in game. I also tried Riptide GP2. Again, the game runs very smoothly without skipping any frames. By default, the highest settings are not chosen though. I went on to set all the settings which the game would allow me to change to high, and the game still ran smoothly, though there was the odd skipped frame. Other games that played without a hitch include Batman Arkham Origins and Ducati Challenge. So in my estimation, the device should be able to handle most current mobile games, although it won't run them all smoothly at the highest possible graphics settings. If you are someone who can live with a few compromises in the graphical quality of their games, you'll be a happy gamer. I must mention here though that initially I had Batman Arkham Origins consistently crash on me, and I never once got past the tutorial. Initially, I thought that it's simply a buggy game at fault, since it hadn't happened earlier. But later I experienced the same even with other games. Further investigation showed that all of my sensors had stopped working. A reboot later, my issues were resolved. The battery performance is a bit of a mixed bag. While on standby, the battery is excellent. On at least 2 occasions, I went about 3 days without charging when I used the phone for nothing but calls and messages. But use the phone more extensively for browsing, gaming, music and the like, and you will probably need to charge the phone by evening. Games especially eat up the battery quite rapidly. For more objectivity on the battery performance, I ran the Antutu battery tester, and the 1S achieved a score of about 4900, putting it in the region of the Mi 3 and Nexus 5. By my estimation, if your usage is moderate, a single charge should last you the day, which probably is good enough by current standards. On the upside, if you are in a situation where the battery is low midday, you can still make it last the day if you decide to restrict usage to basic tasks. The inbuilt browser performs well, pinching and zooming is pretty quick, and switching from portrait to landscape and back is also pretty quick. What I particularly like is the way the text reflows. The only places it got into trouble with reflowing was when I zoomed in on an area close to an image. Call quality and reception at both ends is quite good. The call speaker at the front is loud and clear, and there weren't any complaints from the person at the other end either. During calls, you have an option to record, which is nice. So, is it the perfect budget phone? Well, not quite. For one, the speaker volume is unsatisfactory. Even when set to full, the sound output is quite low. Keeping the phone on its back improves matters a bit, but not enough. And besides, this won't help while gaming. Also, if you happen to cover the speaker grill, the sound is mostly muted. I also do not see any option to choose the default storage location or the ability to move apps to the SD card, despite the phone running on Jelly Bean. One minor quibble I have is with the proximity sensor. The screen takes a bit too long to turn back on after you have held it to your ear. There is also at times a delay when invoking the keyboard. However, these are minor issues and more of irritants in the context. The major issue for me is the phone heating up with basic tasks. Now it is generally expected that a phone will heat up when under heavy load such as say gaming. However, this phone heats up even while web browsing or using the camera. This is a surprise because the phone does not heat up as much when playing casual games like U Ninja or Candy Crush. I did not experience heating issues during other general tasks, save these however, which is a relief. The phone usually gets warm near the camera towards the top. It's not noticeable if you're holding the phone towards the bottom, and in fact I was initially going to say that the amount of heat is not discomforting. But that was before I got a phone call while the phone was a bit warm. And believe me, I could smell what the rock is cooking. The amount of heat does not get so out of hand though, so as to make the device difficult to hold, even with extended gaming. But it is still noticeable and warm enough that putting the phone to one's ears becomes an issue. One theory doing the rounds is that the processor is an overclock 8226 and not the advertised 8228. While CPU-Z and AnTuTu show different processors, there is also a teardown thread on the MiUi forums which suggests that the CPU is indeed an 8228. Either way, underclocking the processor seems to have worked for many. Now I also mentioned earlier that the MiUI experience is very smooth, but qualified it by saying mostly. This is because many have experienced apps force closing and attribute it to poor memory management. Despite not being a heavy multitasker, I did find the music player crashing while web browsing on more than one occasion. This did not happen on every browsing with music session, but happened enough times to be a concern. If the inbuilt RAM manager is to be believed, on a fresh boot, about 400 MB of RAM is free. However, it quickly drops to below 200 MB and is usually between 100 and 150 MB. So the contention is that because of low available RAM, multitasking might pose problems. I don't know if this is the exact reason, but it is true that there are issues. So, is it the perfect budget phone? While Xiaomi have put in impressive hardware and feature-rich software and a very good camera, the experience is marred somewhat by the heating and memory management issues. How much of a problem this is will depend on what sort of user you are. But there is no denying that it's a less than optimal out-of-box experience. The silver lining, of course, is that Xiaomi tends to provide OTA updates frequently, or at least that's my understanding. As of this review, I'm on ROM version 36, and I know that at least number 41 is now available. Should these issues be fixed in this update, this device would definitely be a must-buy. If not though, I'd only recommend it if you are a moderate smartphone user who wants a good camera phone on a very strict budget.